Oh my God, what have I done to myself?
The following morning began like countless others for David. He arrived at his office shortly before 8, carrying a cup of coffee in one hand while scrolling through emails on his phone with the other. His consulting firm occupied the top floor of a modern office building overlooking the city, and from the outside, everything appeared to be falling perfectly into place. The divorce proceedings were moving forward without unexpected complications. Lauren had spent the previous evening showing him listings for waterfront homes they hoped to purchase together after the paperwork was finalized. His business remained profitable, clients continued signing contracts, and for the first time in months, he believed the difficult part of his life was finally behind him. He had convinced himself that he had made the right decision. Yes, people had judged him. Yes, a few friendships had cooled after news of the affair became public. But David believed those reactions would fade with time. Success, he often told himself, had a way of silencing criticism. At exactly 10:17 that morning, his assistant called through the intercom. "David, there's an attorney here asking to see you. He says it's regarding the estate of Robert." David barely looked up from his computer. "Robert?" "Yes. My former father-in-law?" That's what he said. David frowned for a moment before shrugging. "Send him in." A few seconds later, Michael Carter entered the office carrying the same leather document case that had rested on the conference table the previous afternoon. He introduced himself professionally, shook David's hand, and accepted an invitation to sit down. "I'm sorry for your loss," Michael said. David nodded politely. "Thank you. Robert was a good man." It was a sentence that sounded respectful, yet Michael noticed how quickly David moved on. "So, what can I help you with?" Michael carefully removed the sealed envelope. "Mr. Harrison instructed me to deliver this to you personally exactly 6 weeks after his funeral." David stared at the envelope. "My name?" "Yes. What's this about?" "I'm afraid I can't discuss its contents until you've read it." David broke the seal with little concern. At first, he expected routine legal language, perhaps relating to family photographs, sentimental belongings, or some administrative matter connected to the divorce. Instead, he found a handwritten letter. He immediately recognized Robert's handwriting. "David," it began, "if this letter has reached you, then events unfolded in the manner I hoped they would not." David's confident expression faded. He continued reading. "When you married my daughter, I welcomed you into our family because Emily believed in you. That was enough for me. Over the years I watched your ambitions grow, and I admired your determination. But I also watched something else. I noticed that success gradually became more important to you than gratitude. Appearances became more important than loyalty. Achievement became more important than the people celebrating those achievements beside you." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Michael remained silent. "You may wonder why I never confronted you directly. The answer is simple. Character revealed voluntarily teaches far more than character forced by confrontation. Had I challenged you, you might have changed your behavior temporarily. Instead, I chose to wait. Time has a remarkable way of uncovering what conversations never can." David stopped reading. "This is..." He struggled to find the right word. Michael waited patiently. David resumed. "If you ended your marriage to Emily believing there was little left to lose, then you made that decision freely, without influence from wealth or expectation. That is precisely why these instructions exist." David looked up. "What instructions?" Michael slowly slid another document across the desk. "This is the legal notice your father-in-law directed me to deliver alongside the letter." David unfolded the papers. The first page outlined the value of Robert's estate. He read the figure once. Then again. Then a third time. His eyes remained fixed on the page. $412 million. For several seconds, the office became completely silent. Finally, David laughed quietly. "This can't be real." "It is." "No. There's no way." Michael calmly produced certified valuation reports, trust summaries, and court filings. Each document confirmed the same reality. Robert had died one of the wealthiest private investors in the state. David's breathing became noticeably heavier. He lived in that little house. Yes. He drove a 15-year-old pickup. Yes. He never. Michael finished the sentence for him. He never believed wealth needed an audience. David leaned back in his chair, staring toward the window without seeing the skyline beyond it. His thoughts raced through years of memories. Family dinners. Birthdays. Christmas mornings. The old fishing trips Robert occasionally invited him to join, trips David almost always declined because he was too busy. Conversations he barely listened to. Advice he dismissed. Questions he never bothered to ask. For the first time, he realized how little he had actually known the man. Then his attention returned to the legal notice. "What does this mean for me?" Michael answered carefully. "It means you are not a beneficiary of the estate." David nodded slowly. "I figured as much. There's more." Michael turned to the final page. "Mr. Harrison specifically instructed me to inform you that this outcome was never determined by the value of his estate." David looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means the inheritance wasn't taken away from you." David frowned. "You were never included under the circumstances that now exist." Those words landed with unexpected force. David had spent years believing he had walked away from an ordinary family with modest means. Now he discovered that he had never lost $400 million. He had lost the opportunity to prove he deserved to be trusted with a family whose greatest treasure had never been money in the first place. As Michael gathered his papers, David asked one final question. "Does Emily know?" Michael paused. "She knows about the estate." "And does she know about this letter?" "Yes." David lowered his head. For the first time since leaving the kitchen table 6 weeks earlier, certain he abandoned him. The future he had imagined suddenly seemed fragile. And as Michael walked out of the office, closing the door quietly behind him, David remained seated in complete silence, unaware that an even more devastating revelation was waiting inside Robert's letter, a revelation that explained why the old man had been so certain David would make exactly the choice he did. For several minutes after Michael Carter left the office, David remained motionless behind his desk. The morning outside continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Employees answered phones. Elevators opened and closed. Traffic crawled through the streets below. Somewhere down the hallway, laughter drifted from a conference room. Yet inside David's office, time seemed to stop. The legal documents remained spread across his desk, but it was Robert's handwritten letter that held his attention. He picked it up again, this time reading more slowly than before. Every sentence carried the calm, measured tone of a man who had spent months thinking carefully before putting pen to paper. "You may believe this letter exists because I wished to punish you. That assumption would be understandable, but it would also be incorrect. I have reached an age where punishment no longer interests me. Consequences interest me because they teach lessons that anger never can. Every important decision in life eventually asks the same question. What did you value most when nobody knew what you stood to gain?" David swallowed hard. The words refused to leave his mind. He continued reading. "I intentionally allowed you to believe I lived an ordinary financial life because I wanted complete honesty from everyone who entered my daughter's world. If someone treated Emily with love, patience, and loyalty while believing there was no fortune waiting in the background, then I could trust that person completely. Had my wealth been public knowledge, every kind gesture would have carried a question I could never answer with certainty. Was it sincere, or was it an investment?" David slowly lowered the pages. For the first time since meeting Robert all those years earlier, he understood why the older man had never spoken about money. It had never been secrecy for its own sake. It had been protection. His phone vibrated on the desk. "Lauren." He stared at the screen before finally answering. "Hey," she said cheerfully. "How's your morning going?" David hesitated. "Complicated." "What happened?" "My father-in-law's attorney came by." "Oh." There was a brief pause. "Was it about the divorce?" "No." "What then?" David looked once more at the valuation report. It turns out Robert was worth over $400 million. Silence. Complete silence. Lauren didn't respond for several seconds. Finally, she laughed softly. "You're joking." "I wish I was." Another long pause followed. $400 million? A little more. "David." Her voice had changed. "What does that mean?" "It means Emily inherited everything." "And you?" David closed his eyes. "Nothing." Lauren didn't know what to say. The excitement that had filled her voice only moments earlier disappeared completely. She quietly ended the conversation by saying they would talk later that evening. David placed the phone back on the desk, but something about the exchange unsettled him. It wasn't what Lauren had said. It was what she hadn't. She never asked how Emily was coping. She never asked whether David was all right. Her first questions had all centered on the money. For the first time, David heard those questions differently. His thoughts returned to Robert's letter. The greatest mistake people make about wealth is believing it changes character. More often, it simply reveals character that was waiting patiently beneath the surface. Those words echoed through his mind. Over the following days, news of Robert's estate began spreading through legal circles, business communities, and eventually local newspapers after probate filings became public records. Although many financial details remained protected through private trusts, one fact became impossible to hide. The quiet retiree whom almost nobody noticed had left behind one of the largest private estates the region had seen in years. David's phone began ringing constantly. Former acquaintances who had ignored him for months suddenly wanted lunch. Business contacts expressed unusual interest in how he was handling the situation. Reporters attempted to contact him for comment. He declined every request. Inside the office, whispers followed him through the hallways. Employees weren't discussing his business anymore. They were discussing what he had walked away from. Some estimated the loss in financial terms. Others spoke about the irony. But a few older employees viewed it differently. One afternoon, David overheard two longtime managers speaking quietly outside the break room. "I don't think he lost the money," one of them said. The other looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I think he lost the family." David stopped walking. Neither employee realized he was standing just around the corner. The money just made everyone notice. Those words struck harder than anything else he had heard all week. That evening, David drove aimlessly through neighborhoods he hadn't visited in years. Without thinking, he eventually found himself parked across the street from the modest home where Robert had lived. The porch light still glowed automatically as darkness settled over the neighborhood. The flower beds Emily had planted years earlier remained neatly maintained. The old pickup truck was gone. Everything else looked exactly the same. David remembered declining Robert's invitations to sit on that porch after dinner because he always claimed he had another meeting or another client to call. Now he would have given almost anything for one more conversation. One opportunity to ask the questions he never considered important. One chance to explain himself. One chance to hear Robert's perspective without pride standing in the way. But life rarely offers those opportunities after choices have already become permanent. As David sat alone in his car, he unfolded the final page of Robert's letter. He realized he had been avoiding the last section since the attorney left his office. It contained only a few short paragraphs. Yet those paragraphs were about to reveal that Robert's understanding of David's future had gone far beyond simple observation. Months before his death, Robert had quietly uncovered a truth that David believed no one else in the world knew. And once David finished reading those final lines, he understood that the older man had seen through him long before the divorce papers were ever filed. David's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the final page. By now he had convinced himself there could be nothing else capable of surprising him. Robert had already revealed the hidden fortune, explained why he had concealed it, and made it painfully clear that David had excluded himself from becoming part of that legacy. Whatever remained on the last page, David assumed it would simply be a closing farewell. Instead, the very first sentence forced him to stop reading. "If you have reached this final page, then I suspect you are wondering how I seemed so certain about the choices you would eventually make. The truth is, I was never certain. I simply paid attention when others stopped looking." David continued. "Several months before my illness became public, I attended a business luncheon hosted by the Chamber of Commerce. You were scheduled to speak there. I arrived early and intended to surprise you afterward by taking you to lunch. Instead, I witnessed something that changed my understanding of your marriage." David felt his chest tighten. He remembered the event immediately. It had taken place almost a year earlier. Lauren had attended as one of the featured marketing executives. Robert continued. "You never saw me because I chose to leave before the program ended. But from the back of the room, I watched you and another woman remain together long after everyone else had begun leaving. There was nothing inappropriate that anyone else would have noticed. A conversation. A shared laugh. A hand resting briefly on her shoulder. Standing alone, each moment meant very little. But I have lived long enough to recognize the beginning of emotional distance long before it becomes public." David closed his eyes. Robert had been there. The entire time. He remembered glancing across the ballroom once or twice, but he had never noticed the older man seated near the rear exit. He kept reading. "I never mentioned what I saw because marriages deserve the opportunity to heal without outside interference. One moment cannot define a person's future. I hoped I had misunderstood. I hoped you would return your attention to the woman who had stood beside you through every uncertain season of your life." David slowly lowered the page. Robert hadn't accused him. He hadn't confronted him. He had simply waited. And in waiting, he had watched every small decision become a larger one. The letter continued. Over the months that followed, I noticed something else. Emily began apologizing for your absence before anyone even asked where you were. She explained missed birthdays, canceled dinners, forgotten anniversaries, and late-night business meetings with remarkable loyalty. She protected your reputation even while quietly carrying disappointments she rarely admitted aloud. That told me everything I needed to know about her heart. I wondered whether you noticed what she was doing. I eventually concluded that you did not. David felt an ache he could not describe. Memory after memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. Emily covering for him at Thanksgiving. Emily smiling politely when relatives asked why he had missed another family gathering. Emily insisting he was simply working hard for their future. He had accepted every explanation without appreciating what those explanations were costing her. Robert's final observations became even more personal. One evening, while Emily was preparing dinner, I watched her remove her wedding ring for several minutes because washing dishes had irritated the skin beneath it. She placed the ring on the kitchen counter and continued cleaning. When you arrived home, you walked past her without noticing she had been crying. You never asked why. You never asked how her day had gone. You spoke only about a client meeting before returning to your office. That was the moment I realized my daughter had begun feeling lonely while still married. David covered his face. He remembered that evening, not because he recalled Emily crying. He couldn't remember that at all. He remembered the client meeting. He remembered the presentation. He remembered answering emails. But he could not remember looking closely enough at his wife to notice she was hurting. That realization haunted him more than the inheritance ever could. Robert's final paragraph filled less than half a page. David, if you are searching for someone to blame, do not blame me for hiding my wealth. Do not blame Emily for inheriting it. And do not blame fate for placing these consequences before you. Every decision that brought you here was your own. The fortune was never your greatest loss. Your greatest loss occurred the day you stopped recognizing the extraordinary woman who chose to build an ordinary life beside you. There was no signature beneath those words. Only Robert's initials. Simple. Quiet. Exactly as he had lived. David remained alone in his office until long after sunset, reading the letter again and again, hoping the words might somehow change. They never did. Late that evening, he reached for his phone and scrolled to Emily's contact information. His thumb hovered over the call button for nearly a minute. Finally, he pressed it. The phone rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then the call went to voicemail. David didn't leave a message. He ended the call, unaware that Emily had seen his name appear on the screen, stared at it for several seconds, and quietly placed the phone back on the table without answering. For the first time in weeks, their lives were moving toward one another again. But they were no longer moving toward the same future. For the next several days, David tried convincing himself that there was still time to repair the damage. He knew he could never undo the affair or erase the pain he had caused Emily, but he believed that if he explained himself honestly, perhaps she would at least hear him out. He replayed every conversation from the past year, searching for the exact moment when his marriage had begun slipping away. The more he reflected, the more he realized there had never been one dramatic turning point. Instead, there had been hundreds of ordinary moments when he had chosen work over conversation, convenience over presence, and ambition over gratitude. Looking back, he understood something Robert had recognized long before anyone else. Relationships rarely collapse because of a single mistake. More often, they weaken through small disappointments repeated so often that they eventually become impossible to ignore. David called Emily again the following afternoon. Once more, the call went unanswered. He sent a brief text message apologizing for everything and asking if they could meet, even if only for a few minutes. Hours passed without a reply. The silence forced him to confront something he had never experienced before. During their marriage, Emily had always answered. No matter how busy she was, no matter how disappointed she felt, she had always made room for conversation. Now, for the first time, she had chosen peace over another painful discussion. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was simply the boundary of someone who had spent too long carrying a relationship by herself. Lauren noticed the change almost immediately. David became distracted during dinners, canceled weekend plans, and spent long stretches staring out windows instead of participating in conversations. One evening she finally asked the question she had been avoiding. Are you thinking about Emily? David hesitated before answering. I'm thinking about everything. Lauren folded her arms. Is this because of the inheritance? David looked directly at her. No. She searched his face, unsure whether to believe him. If Robert had only left a small estate, would you still feel this way? The question lingered between them. David answered quietly, I honestly don't know. It was the first completely truthful thing he had said in weeks. Lauren lowered her eyes. She had expected reassurance. Instead, she heard uncertainty. The foundation of their relationship had been built while another relationship was falling apart. Now that excitement had disappeared, they were left facing difficult questions neither of them had wanted to ask. Conversations became shorter. Small disagreements turned into arguments. They discovered they knew far less about one another than they had imagined. The future they had planned so confidently suddenly felt uncertain. Meanwhile, Emily immersed herself in the responsibilities Robert had entrusted to her. The inheritance brought enormous responsibility rather than immediate comfort. She met with financial advisors, foundation directors, attorneys, and executives responsible for the companies her father had quietly built over decades. During those meetings, she learned stories about Robert that even she had never heard. Employees described how he had quietly paid medical expenses for workers facing family emergencies. Scholarship recipients spoke about anonymous donations that allowed them to finish college. Small business owners recalled moments when Robert had offered patient guidance instead of demanding immediate profit. Piece by piece, Emily discovered that her father's greatest legacy was not measured by the value of his investments but by the number of lives he had quietly strengthened. One afternoon, Michael Carter handed Emily another sealed envelope. Your father asked me to give you this only after everything else had been completed. Emily smiled softly. It seems he planned for everything. Michael nodded. He certainly tried. Inside was a short handwritten note. My dear Emily, if you ever find yourself wondering whether forgiveness is possible, remember that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same decision. Forgiveness frees your heart from carrying resentment. Reconciliation requires rebuilt trust, and trust can never be demanded. It can only be earned through consistent actions over time. Never allow anyone to convince you otherwise. Emily folded the letter carefully. Those words lifted a weight she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. She no longer felt pressure to decide quickly whether David deserved another chance. Her father had already given her permission to choose wisely instead of emotionally. Several weeks later, David finally received a message from Emily. It was short. She agreed to meet. Not at their old home. Not at a restaurant filled with memories. Instead, she suggested a quiet public park where she and Robert had often walked together on Sunday afternoons. David arrived early. He sat alone on a wooden bench beneath tall oak trees, rehearsing everything he intended to say. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell Emily that Robert's letter had changed him. Most of all, he wanted one final opportunity to ask whether the future they once imagined could somehow still be saved. As the afternoon sun filtered through the branches, David saw Emily walking toward him. She looked calm, confident, different from the woman he had left crying at the kitchen table months earlier. She carried no anger in her expression. But neither did she carry hope. As she reached the bench, David stood. Before either of them spoke a single word, he realized this conversation would determine the rest of his life. And although he had spent weeks preparing for this moment, nothing could prepare him for Emily's first sentence. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The park was peaceful, almost unchanged from the afternoons Emily had spent there with Robert over the years. Children laughed in the distance. A light breeze carried the sound of leaves moving gently overhead. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon Robert had always loved, and somehow that made the conversation ahead feel even more significant. David searched Emily's face for a sign that she might still be willing to rebuild what they had lost. Instead, he saw something he had never truly noticed before. Peace. Not the peace of someone whose life had been easy, but the peace of someone who had finally stopped fighting a battle alone. Emily broke the silence. Before you say anything, I want you to know that I listened to every voicemail you never left. David looked confused. She gave a faint smile. I saw every missed call. Every text message. I knew you were trying to reach me. Then, why didn't you answer? Emily took a slow breath, because for the first time in a very long time, I needed to hear my own thoughts before I listened to yours. David lowered his eyes. He nodded quietly. I understand. Emily continued. When you left, I kept asking myself what I had done wrong. I replayed every conversation, every disagreement, every ordinary day. I wondered whether I had failed you somehow. Her voice remained calm. Then I started reading my father's letters. David remained silent. He reminded me of something I had forgotten. What was that? That love should never require someone to constantly prove they're worthy of being chosen. Those words settled heavily between them. David wanted to respond immediately, but he knew interrupting her would only repeat the same mistakes that had brought them here. Emily looked toward the walking trail before continuing. I spent years defending you. David closed his eyes. I know. I defended your late nights. I know. I defended the missed birthdays. He nodded. I know. I defended the business trips. Again, he nodded. And when people asked why you weren't there, I always made excuses because I believed protecting our marriage meant protecting your reputation. David felt tears forming for the first time in years. I'm sorry. Emily looked at him kindly. I believe you are. The words gave him a brief moment of hope. Then she continued. But being sorry and being ready are two different things. David frowned slightly. What do you mean? I believe you regret what happened. I do. I also believe losing my father forced you to reflect on your choices. It did. And I believe Robert's letter changed the way you see your life. David answered without hesitation. It changed everything. Emily nodded. I believe all of that. Hope returned to David's face. Then Emily gently said the words he feared most. But none of those things rebuilt trust overnight. Silence returned. After several moments, David finally spoke. Are you saying there's no chance? Emily looked directly into his eyes. I'm saying that I spent years hoping for changes that only arrived after you lost something important. David immediately replied. You were important. I know. You always were. Emily smiled sadly. Then why did it take losing me for you to realize it? David opened his mouth. No answer came. Because there wasn't one. Every explanation he had rehearsed sounded hollow now. Stress. Work. Pressure. None of it explained why he had stopped seeing the woman who stood beside him every single day. Emily reached into her handbag and removed a folded sheet of paper. My father wrote something else. David recognized Robert's handwriting immediately. She read aloud. When someone finally learns the value of loyalty after betraying it, that lesson is genuine. But genuine lessons do not erase genuine consequences. She carefully folded the paper again. I've forgiven you, David. He looked up immediately. You have? Yes. Relief washed across his face. Then Emily quietly added. But forgiveness doesn't always mean returning. The hope disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Emily continued gently. If I came back now, I would always wonder whether you loved me because of who I am. Or because losing everything finally showed you what you had. David answered almost instantly. I know the difference now. Emily nodded. I believe you. Then please. His voice broke. Please let me spend the rest of my life proving it. Emily's eyes filled with tears. If life worked that way, my father would still be sitting on his porch. Neither of them spoke. After nearly a minute, Emily stood. She looked down at David one final time. I truly hope you become the man Robert always believed you could be. David looked up. And us? Emily's answer came softly. There won't be an us. She paused. But I sincerely hope there's a better you. With those words, she turned and began walking slowly down the path Robert had loved so much. David remained seated on the bench, watching until she disappeared beyond the trees. He understood then that some opportunities in life exist only once. Not because people refuse to forgive, but because time never returns the moments we take for granted. As the evening sun settled over the park, David reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded Robert's letter one last time. For the first time, he wasn't reading it to search for another chance. He was reading it to remember the lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. And years later, when people asked Emily what became of the fortune her father had left behind, her answer surprised almost everyone. Because the greatest part of Robert's legacy was never the $400 million. It was what that fortune allowed Emily to become after she finally discovered her own strength. In the months that followed, the headlines gradually faded. The newspapers that had briefly reported on the extraordinary estate moved on to other stories. Business magazines stopped speculating about Robert's investments. The public's curiosity slowly disappeared, just as it always does. But for the people whose lives had been touched by Robert Harrison, the real story was only beginning. Emily declined nearly every interview request she received. She had no interest in becoming known as the woman who inherited hundreds of millions of dollars after a painful divorce. That was never the story she wanted people to remember. Instead, she focused on honoring the values her father had lived by. Working closely with Michael Carter and a team of experienced financial professionals, she established the Robert Harrison Foundation, dedicated to expanding educational opportunities for children from low-income communities, supporting vocational training programs, assisting military veterans transitioning back into civilian life, and funding medical research through long-term grants. Just as Robert had done throughout his lifetime, many of the foundation's donations remained anonymous. Emily often smiled whenever organizations publicly wondered who their mysterious benefactor might be. She already knew what her father would have said. If people focused more on the gift than the person giving it, then the gift had accomplished exactly what it was meant to do. The modest home where Robert had lived remained exactly as he had left it. Although financial advisors suggested selling the property because of its desirable location, Emily refused. Every creaking floorboard, every handmade bookshelf, every worn gardening tool carried memories that no amount of money could replace. Instead, she carefully restored the house while preserving its simple character. On quiet Sunday afternoons, she still sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee, watching neighbors walk their dogs just as Robert had done for years. Many stopped to chat without ever mentioning the inheritance. They remembered Robert not as a wealthy investor, but as the kind man who shoveled snow from elderly neighbors' driveways, repaired broken bicycles for children, and quietly delivered groceries whenever someone fell on difficult times. Emily realized that her father had achieved something remarkably rare. The people who loved him had done so long before they ever knew what he owned. David's life changed in quieter ways. His consulting business continued operating, but success no longer carried the same satisfaction it once had. Colleagues noticed that he became less interested in expensive displays of achievement and more interested in mentoring younger employees. He established scholarship funds within his company for interns pursuing business degrees and encouraged managers to prioritize time with their families instead of celebrating endless overtime. Some people believed these changes were an attempt to repair his public image, but those who worked closely with him saw something different. He no longer measured success by quarterly profits alone. Robert's letter had become a permanent reminder sitting inside the top drawer of his desk. On difficult days, he occasionally unfolded its worn pages and reread the passages that challenged him most. The inheritance was gone forever, but the lesson remained. As for Lauren, the relationship that had once seemed so exciting gradually came to an end. Without the secrecy and excitement that had first drawn them together, they discovered their connection lacked the deeper foundation required to survive ordinary life. The breakup was neither dramatic nor hostile. It simply reflected two people realizing they had built their future upon circumstances that were never meant to last. David accepted the ending without argument. Deep inside, he understood that the relationship had not failed because of Robert's fortune. It had failed because it began while another commitment was being broken. That truth became impossible to ignore. Nearly 5 years later, Emily attended the dedication ceremony for a new public library funded entirely through the Robert Harrison Foundation. Hundreds of local residents gathered as community leaders thanked the anonymous donors who had made the project possible. Although many people suspected Emily had played an important role, she quietly stood near the back of the crowd without introducing herself. As children rushed through the library doors for the first time, laughing as they explored shelves filled with books and computers they had never previously been able to access, Emily looked toward the sky and thought about her father. Robert had once told her that real wealth should continue improving lives long after its owner was gone. Standing there, she finally understood exactly what he meant. On that same afternoon, several miles away, David happened to drive past one of the foundation's community projects. A plaque near the entrance carried Robert's name. David parked his car and walked slowly toward it. He stood there for several minutes reading the inscription. "Character is the greatest inheritance any parent can leave behind." Those words stayed with him long after he returned to his car. He smiled sadly. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because he finally understood that Robert's greatest gift had never been the fortune itself. It had been the wisdom that accompanied it. Years earlier, David believed success meant acquiring more. Robert had spent an entire lifetime proving that success was measured by what remained after everything money could buy had lost its importance. And perhaps that is the lesson this true story leaves with all of us. Fortunes can be built. Companies can rise and fall. Homes, cars, investments, and possessions can all disappear with time. But the way we treat the people who love us becomes our real legacy. Because one day, every one of us will leave something behind. The only question is whether the people who remember us will speak first about what we owned, or about who we chose to be.